I come from a small village on the Kuskokwim. It's called Napaskak. I mainly grew up there, but I started out in Gwichlook. My first 2 years I was there. My dad is originally from that village, and my mom from Napaskak. My mom went out when she wanted to move. So my formative years were at Napaskak, but those two villages are pretty close together anyway. So our perspectives are pretty much the same. I grew up there speaking Yupik as my first language, just like everybody else there. I didn't start learning English until I was second grade. And then, in that particular area, all I knew about myself was that I was a Yuk and a Yupik, depending on the context. I didn't learn about being a Yupik until I went off to boarding school. As an explanation, the Kuskokwim, lower Kuskokwim River villages refer themselves as being Yupik when the right context is there. In the lower Yukon, they're Yupik. In the coastal, they're Yupik, but they have different dialects. In between them, there's a Chupik group. And then on the island, there's a Chupik group. And south of us is the Shukbek group. We basically all speak the same language. Siberian Yupik off on Siberian, I mean the island, I can understand probably 40 to 50% of what they talk about. Inukbek, not so much. We do have some common words, but we've diverged long enough time ago that we don't understand each other that, just right off the bat. My perspective, well, I'll ramble all over. So if I say something and you want to come back to it, please remind me. But my perspective is going to be particularly from my village and also the commonalities that I've received and heard about while I've done a lot of traveling throughout the region. And it's pretty much the same commonalities. There's not so much any difference from the perspective that I got from the elders and the people that helped raise me in Napaskak. ANCSA was accepted and not accepted at the same time, and I'll explain the perspective behind that. We are a far-looking people, and we look back way far back too at the same time. And it's part of because of who we are. And I think you need to understand what it means to be a Yupik or a Yupik in order to get the perspective that I'm trying to or will be conveying to you this morning. In my group, we don't say that we're a Yupik or a Yupik among ourselves. In fact, we always refer to ourselves as just being a regular person, a Yuk. And even when someone from our basically tribe comes from another village, we ask whether he's just a Yuk. We don't say that they're a Yupik or a Yupik, a real human being. Only when there's outsiders among us do we say that we call ourselves that. I do a lot of traveling around the region, and usually I try to go to schools nowadays and talk to these students there. And one of the first questions I ask them is, who's a Yupik or a Yupik in this classroom? And invariably, just about every one of them would raise their hands like that. And it's true, it's true and not true at the same time. Our elders, I was told, not only me, but people of my generation were told that following the dictates of the federal government will make you forget who you are. So don't follow them too easily. I'm translating there. And in fact, one person in one village had said that his grandpa had told him that the federal government would be the source of our losing our Yupickness. And that's a very true statement. With ANCSA, we became part of that act because of the blood that we have. And that's all the federal government requires, basically. There are exceptions when the whole community accepts a person who's not really a Yupik as being a member of the tribe. And there's been people, very few, that have been accepted into the act and became participants in the act, even though they were not Yupik blood-wise. In my system, we recognize that it's a long process to become that real human being. And that's where our perspective comes into in trying to make ANCSA work. I said that ANCSA was accepted and not accepted. In my village, there was one person that came into the community and talked to one person who happened to be a second warden in the church. And based on that, I was told that the community of Nabaskat accepted the dictates of ANCSA. But people didn't accept it, and that's why I said it was accepted and not accepted. As a Yupik, we don't have chiefs, traditional chiefs in our system. Because of our process, Yuyarak is what we call it, that process of becoming a real human being. You're supposed to improve yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually, day in, day out. And in fact, that was a common, we were always told not to follow our own minds, but then we'd be told what was the proper way of thinking to advance. And we were always told to mull over, to think about what we had been told, because it applied to whether or not we advanced as a human being to the point where we become a man or a woman. And we have different terms for becoming a man, as opposed to becoming old, and for a woman too. So that's our kind of our long-range view of our systems. ANCSA said to my older people, there's a new way of living coming, so you have to adapt to it. And our people are very used to and are familiar with adapting. Our stories go back so far back that they tell of when the Earth's crust was thin and we lived a different lifestyle than what we do now. And it might not be in the same place, but we're very well aware of the fact that we have to make a living in order to be on this earth. That's a given. But it's a given also that we have to change with any changes that occur. And ANCSA was a change that we accepted in order to, to live. Subsistence was mentioned. Subsistence is a way of living. It's not the Yuyarak. A lot of people mix up the two nowadays. They think that Yuyarak is a way of living, subsistence is a way of living. It's a livelihood. Just like going to work is a livelihood. And that's why when, before ANCSA, when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act forbidded our natives or people from doing any bird hunting, they just totally ignored it and continued to hunt and harvest those food resources because that was our livelihood. So that's the perspective that we have. We don't have chieftains. We come at decisions in a consensus kind of way, and especially at the elder level. It never happened with the ANCSA that never happened with ANCSA. But those elders knew that we had to get ready, and especially they had to get my generation and younger generations ready to live a different kind of lifestyle. So they were telling us right from the get-go. I was a 9-year-old kid when ANCSA was passed. Within months after it was passed and news got out to my village, they started telling us little boys, they used to separate us out, little boys and little girls, and start talking to us not only about survival skills, but also about what it meant to become a real human being. They started preparing us to live this lifestyle that ANCSA was mandating for our people. But at the same time, we were all taught how to live the subsistence lifestyle too, as a hedge, because you never can know what will sustain your family, in the future. So that's the background that we have with my village being Yupik and ANCSA. We're willing to work it out. We recognize that there are parts for everybody. That's how it's always been. And we see ANCSA in that respect too. The federal government has its part. State government has its part. We have our part to make that legislation work. And we have a long view to make it work. Just because that's how we view our worldview. That's our worldview. Even though they didn't accept it, they want to make it work, and that's how we were taught. So that's what we're trying to do now. Now, I do a lot of traveling in my position to the villages and meet with the tribes and village corporations and general public basically out there. And a lot of the comments and concerns I'm getting now is that the state government is not doing its part. And even the oil companies are expected to do their part in this legislation. So not just the governments and us, but also private business. A lot of the frustration that we're seeing now is federal government and state governments are not doing their part. They expected my people to enter into this system of livelihood that was totally foreign to us. And they expected us to do it right away and be operating in it basically just as any Western business would be operating it in right away. We were willing to teach us and our kids to become part of that system, and we are still trying to do that, and we will not stop continuing to try to do that. We recognize that the economy changes, and even more so now, so we will not stop trying to ensure that ANCSA is a success. But the other players have to do their part too. In my area particularly, we see that they're not doing their part. There are known factors for having a successful growing business that will add jobs and employ people. And it's been known by the Western society for a long time because they've had businesses for a long time. Those factors that go into making for a successful corporation have not been developed by the state or the federal government out in rural Alaska. ANCSA has over 200 corporations, a majority of them village corporations. The regions are doing pretty well. They have more resources and better opportunity to get better employees. But out in rural Alaska, a lot of the village corporations do not have the same access to those same resources that the regions do. So it's extra tough for them to operate a successful business that's growing. But they've kind of done it the past 40 years. But they can't do it alone. Like I said, other players have to do their part. In urban Alaska, the businesses get the advantage of public projects like roads and everything else that can make the cost of doing business cheaper. They get the advantage of that without having to pay or lobby for it. Out in rural Alaska, there aren't any public works that are put into the state that make it easier for corporations to operate. I do talk to people that I see at the Bethel Airport. That's a hub of my region. Many of them nowadays are coming into Anchorage to do their shopping. And I ask them whether or not they're coming in for a meeting or if they have a hospital appointment. And surprisingly, many of them do not. So that tells me that they're paying for their own way from their village to Bethel, to Anchorage, getting a hotel, renting a car, everything, you know, all the costs associated with coming into town, doing their shopping, and they still find it cheaper to do all that than to shop at the village corporation store, or even at the Bethel businesses, and that's a regional hub. We have communities that are 1 mile apart, 5 miles apart, 10 miles apart, and they're not even connected. So they can't begin to utilize any economies of scale in their businesses. And that's a necessity for any business nowadays. You have to be able to compete. And if you can't have any economies of scale, you cannot compete. So that's why we have so many of our people. And I would hazard a guess that the Fairbanks area communities are also doing that. Any village areas with major population centers are probably experiencing that. So we need our other players to step up. We can do our part, and we've been doing it, but we need the other players to step up and do their part. Maybe if we all did our parts, the act itself can begin to work. But right now, it's on the verge of being a complete failure because of what I said. The village economies are not growing, they're not developing, they're not transitioning us from a subsistence lifestyle to a job lifestyle. And a lot of the people out there are feeling that. That's why they want subsistence back again. The jobs economy without the state and federal governments doing their part will not develop to the point where any of the ANCSA corporations out there can begin to add jobs to the economy. Right now, a lot of family groups pool their resources. You know, 1 or 2 family members might have a job. Then the whole family system can help each other by those 2 job earners, because it takes money nowadays to get the tools for subsistence. In my own case, I have a fish camp out there, and there's 4 families that benefit from that one fish camp. All the other fish camps out there are pooling of several families. That's how it works out there, just because you need to do it that way. It'd be really nice if every family could have a job out there, but the economy has not developed to the point where every family can have a job. So that's what's lacking from ANCSA right now. The village corporations have to be afforded that chance to be competitive with urban businesses and corporations. Too many of our people are and deserved, and understandably so, not supporting their own village corporations. You know, cost of living being what it is, and the lack of income being what it is out there.
Andrew, I hear you saying that the choice in ANCSA to have a corporate form be the predominant way to economic development almost has unspoken assumptions in it about access to cheap electricity, or to electricity at all in some cases, to communications, to necessary infrastructure that in your region doesn't exist.
Yes. Like I said, our villages might be 1 mile apart, but they're not connected. There's airports, so they fly in between them. And air transportation is one of the highest ways of transporting anything. We utilize the BART system in the summer months to bring in bulk goods and stuff like that. But that's the rest of the year we have to use the airports and those other high cost ways of transporting goods. And then electricity is another big cost of doing business out there. Our residents, and that includes every resident out there, has a benefit of PCE, power cost equalization, that kind of brings down the cost of energy for individuals and families out there. But the businesses are not included in that program, so they don't get any benefit of any subsidy or any benefit from any state programs to help their businesses. And that's what they see. The state is totally failing. The state really benefited from the act with the oil money that came in. The state should, from the get-go, been developing the economy out there. It totally ignored it. The oil companies I mentioned, we see as having an obligation too, and there's one particular obligation that they have through the pipeline that was still up, was to hire our own natives. I think up to the 20% level. Even that was not adhered to, and we're trying to get that employment rate up to that level, even to this day. There is no reason why we shouldn't be at that level even 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We have so many people that are educated already, able to do those kind of jobs.
So historically, Andrew, can you describe what involvement Yupik people had in fighting for land claims rather than seeing the land being just taken away?
Our involvement was through AFN, and it wasn't every village. It was some people with some ties to some villages, but not every village. And we have a hard time saying our land too, because, and we don't even recognize when white people say it's their land or the federal government says it's their land to this day. In our particular Yupik way, we don't think of the land as being ours. We're just there. We are there, and because we make use of the land, we take care of it, and we take care of it because we know that our future descendants will need to use that same land and use the same resources and stuff like that. In that respect, we don't recognize it as being our land, but with the act, we do say now, it's our land. And I think that's one of the things that really weaken our people in our communities, because now we have village corporations saying, this is my land, so shareholders from other villages can't come onto this land and do subsistence harvesting and stuff like that.
Does your, Andrew, does your current land policy reflect that way of thinking to some degree, or is it more structured in kind of in terms of modern day land use best practices?
Our land policy is directed toward the subsurface. That's where our majority ownership is. The surface area where much of the activity takes place is at the village corporation level.
So your land policy doesn't really touch on much surface. It mostly is subsurface, and the village talks about the surface?
Yes. But we're very active in subsistence matters at the regional level, just because we know that it's something that's near and dear to every shareholder and descendant that we have out there.
Has the resource revenue provision of ANCSA benefited your region?
Yes, in fact, I would say that that's one of the main reasons why a lot of our village corporations are still surviving. The injection that they get through 7J allows them to buy like bulk gas at the beginning of the season or other bulk products that their village stores need. Very much helpful, yeah.
Other questions from your discussions yesterday, guys?
So first of all, I had an opportunity to travel to villages all across Alaska, and one of my favorites in the whole state is Kwethluk. I have very fond memories of getting off the airplane and being invited to someone's house and having subsistence food while I was the only one who spoke English around the table. So it was very humbling and grounding experience for me. So, but one of the things that you said, or you've spoken a lot about, you know, your Yupik culture and how important it is in living off the land and subsistence. So can you share a little bit from your view of how as a corporation, Calista has been maybe Yupicized? Have your people you know, grown your corporation to be a reflection of your culture? Because we know that INCSA is a very Western model. So how have you kind of tailored it to your people and your culture?
We're looking more toward our descendants in making sure Calista will be a viable entity here and into thousands of years. You know, I talked a little bit about Yuyak before and how each person is supposed to develop into a real human being, but part of that is you're supposed to fully use your abilities, your natural abilities to develop yourself. Whether it be in the subsistence field or in this new area that we're in, not so new anymore, 40 years of being part of a corporation. There's many parts of a corporation, and our biggest effort right now is to ensure that we have our not only present people but future generations trained up and working and being fully operating those, filling those positions that are required to operate a corporation, whether or not it be in the parent company, but also in all of the operating businesses that we have. That's a big push that we have. It's just getting the resources, enough resources in order for us to be able to do it fully. We're still in the developing and growth mode in that respect.
Can you add to that and speak a little bit about the mission or your vision for your corporation? And how, is that a reflection at all about your Yupik values?
The mandate of ANCSA basically really goes well with being Yupik. The main mandate is to improve the socioeconomic living conditions of our people. And we take that to heart, not only at the corporate level, but in trying to ensure that our people out in the villages are getting some improvement in their socioeconomic living conditions. And in fact, the other part of ANCSA mandate being a profitable company, and being a profitable company really contributes to that other part of the mandate of ANCSA. So we're trying really hard to do both, and in fact, our 5 goals basically touch those 2 areas that ANCSA mandated, and that we know that we need, being Yupik, to benefit the whole, not even the whole, but each individual, each member too, without basically letting others not have any benefit from that. We haven't enrolled our post-ANCSA natives, those born after December 1871. We're putting that questions to our shareholders this coming annual meeting, and we hope that it gets a good result. But even with the fact that we haven't included them, we are cognizant of the fact that we need to benefit them because they are part of us, and will, and ANCSA itself, even though they didn't include those born after 71, that's not, ANCSA is not a determinant from our view. Like I said, don't follow them too much in what they try to do to you, box you into a particular area. And interesting question comes up in terms of our post-ANCSA natives. Are they really bound by the Act itself too? That's what I meant about we don't accept it too, because like remember I said that we come to decisions basically in a consensus kind of way. ANCSA wasn't done that way, so for us that have shares, we accept that we benefited from it. But for those that don't have shares, they're not really bound to that act the way we see it. They still have their full hunting, fishing rights, their full everything that they need to have in order to in order to progress into a real human being, in order to support their families, in order to live on this earth. They still have everything that my ancestors had before ANCSA. That's how we see it.
On that thought, Andrew, is there any connection in your mind outside of the use of the land that makes a person a real human being? Is there a need for land ownership in some fashion there, whether it be village or tribe?
I would have to say no. The whole point of becoming a real human being is to become unselfish.
Andrew, I imagine it's a real challenge to keep your youth and your later generations both in the village because of the challenges of the economic challenges that are there. In this day and age, I imagine you're losing a lot of your youth to a bigger city. How are you trying to, I mean, I can see a real challenge in trying to keep the culture thriving when you're losing your younger generations for an economic reason. You know, they're not leaving the village for, you know,
Yeah.
reasons that are personal. They're leaving from an economic point of view. So
Yeah.
how do you keep it together and the traditions moving
The
forward?
subsistence is an economy. Jobs is an economy. They don't have a direct relation to whether or not you become a real human being. They're part of the system, but they don't have a direct bearing on whether or not you become a real human being. And that's how I was taught growing up. I work in a corporation. I'm an attorney. I worked in the legal field for a long time. But I also do subsistence activities just because they taught me you got to keep that skill set with you. You don't know what will be happening in the future. You might need to depend on your subsistence skills at one time. You know, teach them to your children too. So that's what I'm doing. All my kids grew up here in town. So they don't have that connection to the village life like they should. They like to spend all summer there, and I let them. But I have them come back and do school here, even though they want to have school out there. The school system here is a lot better. But I also tell them it doesn't matter where you live, whether or not you become a real human being. It's up to you to live within that guideline, and there'll be factors at play that affect you as you make your journey through life. But they won't. You yourself will have the ultimate power, I guess, to ensure that they don't adversely affect you. Those outside powers or systems of living.
Can I ask a question? You made a comment that I thought was really interesting about the fact that there are villages that are a mile or 5 miles or 10 miles apart that aren't necessarily taking advantage of economies of scale. And I'm wondering how much you see there being either competition or collaboration between the corporations, and what the opportunities you think there might be in that. Do we think we're moving more towards collaboration, more towards competition?
There's one village grouping in my region that merged, and that's the Kashkukum Corporation, merger of 10 villages. I wish that happened a lot more with the groupings that we have in my region, just so that they'd have pooling of their resources, the ones that are 5 miles, 1 mile apart. And then I don't know if they can still do that, but that would be a better scenario for having a more successful village corporation in my mind.
Andrew, you had said that you believe that INGSA is on the verge potentially of a failure because of a lack of community infrastructure and investment in basic, what I would classify as basic community needs by the state of Alaska and the federal government. And that this sounds like it's potentially a missing link to INGSA. What do you think the solution to that is? Do we seek an amendment? Do we seek, state legislation? How do we fix this? Because it's now 40 plus years later, and it's still an issue, a very real issue in all of our villages, including mine.
The state has to come in, They made us state corporations, and in the state's part is to ensure ANGSA works too. State has to do its part in order for they have to create that environment where a business can, even with competition with other village corporations, where a business can begin to thrive. Without those factors in place, no corporation out there can even begin to grow and add jobs like the intent of the legislation was. And the state's had 40 years to do it. The issue wasn't as critical when the price of oil was so low that transporting materials out there or the energy costs were still low. But with the high cost of oil nowadays affecting transportation and energy out there, it's made the need and the focus that much clearer.
It seems like if the state wants to benefit a certain industry, they certainly can pass laws to do that, you know, whether it's through favorable taxation or direct support, and I don't see where that's ever happened for native corporations.
Yeah. And you know, the state has, like I said, has had an opportunity these past 40 years to be doing its part. It's not a Democrat, Republican kind of thing. We need visionary leaders at the state government level.
Has the AFN ever banded together to try and work on the issue of power cost equalization for the rural?
Excuse me?
Has the AFN ever worked together to try and get something passed, lobbied through the state to have the power cost equalization extended to the rural?
Yeah, we've been lobbying all these years
At AFN?
at the AFN corporate village level. What I found is that they expect us to be doing everything. One project that we are really pushing is a hydropower project out for our region. And my discussions with the state administrators about that project, they recognize it, that it's a good project, that it will bring down cost of electricity, cost of doing business out there. But they're not willing to put their weight behind it in terms of actual money. They expect us to seek the money from the local legislative share. And that's what I meant. You're not being visionary at that top level. If a state is willing to put all the money and resources into, like the Susitna hydropower project, they should be doing it for every hydropower project out there that will help all, not just Alaska residents, but ANCSA corporations, because state has a real obligation to ensure that ANCSA is success just by the fact that the state was probably one of the main benefactors of the act. So that's a perspective that I'm bringing in from my village, and hopefully I'm understandable.
Andrew, do you feel like the regions or through AFN that regions have banded together enough to make the voice of Alaska Natives heard at the state level? Because clearly we are an economic force in this economy, and a very recognized now a very strong voice on social issues. And I'm wondering whether you feel like we've really together got ourselves one voice on the issues to be able to be heard at the state level. Because I could see where if Shalista's lobbying for a hydropower project, or somebody else is lobbying for an individual project, that it disperses the voice. And it is easier to, at a state level, I think, for people to not hear or to look at Shalista as one, instead of looking at us as one people's.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Do you think we're doing enough first together, collectively, before we go to the state?
No, we're not. When we do it at the AFN level, it's usually very general. But when we need to lobby, it's usually for specific projects, and that's where we kind of basically fall apart and do our own thing. That's a very good suggestion, though.
Is it something that you guys discuss at the regional CEOs level?
I've been bringing it up, but we're still doing our own things.
Exactly.
Because we have so much need in each different region, you know.
I imagine it would be hard to prioritize.
Yeah.
I can see us being a very strong voice if we're collective about and purposeful about asking for what we need. But I can see that, how do you choose between the needs of one village or another?
Yeah.
Because they're so great.
Yeah. Right now, subsistence is that unifying force. Last year, they closed subsistence fishing down during the critical time when, and I mean on the lower Kuskokwim River, critical time when people are harvesting and starting to dry and smoke their fish. The state closed it for a long, long time. Every village on that lower river area agreed to go out and fish just because they needed to. Even during that closure last year, I don't know how many of you followed that. And the state let it go. Then there were villagers that went beyond that or fished beyond that window. And those were the ones that were cited. And those were the ones that were in the news going through that trial. This year, there weren't any closures, even though the state basically kind of forecasted that the runs wouldn't be enough to meet escapement needs. But I think they saw the power of villagers, many villagers acting together. ANCSA basically, and not only ANCSA, but the Indian Reorganization Act basically separated out, in my case, the Yupiks, we're very, one of the larger tribes, peoples in the state. IRA Act and ANCSA basically set villages, your village corporation, your village tribe, that kind of system. Whereas our prior history had been to work together. We live in one of the most richest areas in terms of subsistence in the state. Our word for fish is the word for food, because we fish all year long. It's not just salmon that we fish for. It's all the other fish species that we have in the river, the lakes, and the ocean. And that doesn't even count the land mammals that are available to us. So, looking at it, I think subsistence, the issue that's coming to a head, especially the salmon being so integral to our diet, I think will force us to really look at whether or not this IRA Act and the ANCSA model experiment is really working for us. I would argue that it's not. It's made us weaker as a people, having us do our own thing at the local level, regional level, that kind of stuff.
So, Andrew, I had a question, and I know you were saying the state needs to step up and do its part. And I know subsistence, specifically salmon, and the king salmon run in your particular region. Is the state reaching out and working directly with Chilista and the other villages in looking at, I know they're doing research around the king salmon runs out there. Are they reaching out, involving enough inclusion, enough voice for the Alaska Native people in the region on those issues as it relates to subsistence?
Not through Jalista, but I think through AVCP and the Salmon Working Group out of the Kuskokwim and the Yukon areas.
So one of the things that you had mentioned, I thought was a very interesting comment. You said that descendants, that the Yupiks have discussed that, are descendants bound to the act, and that there's maybe an underlying feeling that they're not, that they still have their full hunting and subsistence rights. And so if you are now taking up the issue of opening enrollment at your next annual meeting, is that then going to impact their hunting and subsistence rights?
That's a question that's very interesting.
Yeah, so I guess I'm hoping to get your insight into that. I mean, how do you think your shareholders are going to react? And then
depending on
there's this undercurrent.
Depending on the vote that occurs, whether or not it's an advisory vote that's coming up. If it gets enough support to have a real vote on it next year, I'll definitely ask for a legal opinion on that question.
And then, but there's also this undercurrent that you can feel statewide of those of us that weren't alive when the act was passed and we're not original shareholders, of feeling like we're left out, that we are somehow less than our parents' generation because we aren't shareholders. We don't have a voice at the table.
Yeah,
And so
and I think that's a really wrong message that's been kind of given to our younger generations. Whereas the message should have been, hey, you still have everything that's denied me being an original ANCSA shareholder.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah,
And
the ANCSA was not a tribal act. It affected the individual natives. It didn't affect my tribe. That my tribe didn't decide to accept ANCSA. That's why I said we accept it and we don't accept it. Looking at it from an individual way, we're bound. We're benefiting. I have 100 shares, original shares. My kids, they're not part of that act. They're not bound by it. They still have their right to become a real human being.
So do you think that's a unique perspective amongst your region as opposed to the other regions throughout the state?
I don't know. I haven't really asked it of the other regions. I do ask about some Inupiaks and some Shuhpiaks about whether or not they still have this Yuyak like we do in the Yupik to become a real human being. But I think it's been lost in those regions. And it's been lost in a lot of my area too. I think the major deaths that we experienced really disconnected a lot of families from that. Even though many bits and pieces of it survived in family groups and the village groups.
So we listened to Byron yesterday, and he had said, I asked him what are some of the top issues facing ANCs today that we need to address as Alaska Native people to make us relevant for the future. And one of his, he had many items. One of them was that ANCs need to define our place in Alaska beyond just economics. And he referred to like the Inkster Regional Economic Report. And he said that the problem when we look at an ANC and only define it in economic terms as the measurement, that it begins to define natives as they're all okay as long as the ANC is doing well. And I thought that was a really interesting point, one that I haven't heard before, because Alaska Natives are many things beyond just economics. And so I was wondering, your thoughts on that, and if you could define ANCs beyond just economics, what that definition might be.
It's a livelihood. Like I said, having a job in an ANC, being a part of an ANC and getting the benefits out of profits of an ANC, it helps you in your livelihood. It's just one factor that you have, being a native. I agree with Byron. ANCSA or any other federal act should not define us. And that's what I've been told a lot. Don't be quick to follow the dictates of the federal government as in the laws that relate to you. Because they're not, they don't know what's best for you.
I can add to that a little in that where I grew up, Pribilofs, we were heavily impacted by Russians and then the federal government coming in. So when I grew up very Western. We had, government was in there, they had all of their people there. So we had to work for them and they dictated what we had to do. So I grew up with a very westernized lifestyle. I grew up in the village, but I had running water. I ate pork chops every night and that sort of thing. So I lost all of the, we never danced. I didn't learn the language. Didn't learn to, we subsisted, but not very much because the government said, oh no, you get this food every month or day or whatever. And so we lost a lot of that. So I think it's great that you guys were able.
Yeah. That's a lot of the general experience of a lot of people. I have a lot of Russian influence myself, being Russian Orthodox. We were Orthodox a long time ago. Becoming a real human being includes the spiritual aspect too. That's a whole other topic that can take a whole hour. But what I was taught was that, we took up Christianity, in our case Russian Orthodoxy, without it being forced on us. But what I was told was that the Russian Orthodox came and completed our Yuyak. They didn't come to destroy what it took to become a real human being. They came and completed it. In our old system, we had the Samyo. That was our god. Samyo, we called him. It's basically like the Jewish god, with the Russian Orthodox Trinity. So we renamed or put a new name to it, Agayun, reflecting the Trinity. We used to be a warrior people a long time ago. We have plenty of stories about that. And we have a lot of place names about the process or going to war in my region. But we laid down our arms voluntarily right before the Russians came. And it was because of this concept that I've been telling you about Yuyak, about improving yourself all the time. It got to the point where as a whole people, we saw that it didn't make sense to be hurting each other or other people with war. And that's why we laid down our arms.
Can I kind of shorthand a philosophy that I think I hear you saying, which would be, don't let what you think you own, such as stock, shares of stock, define who you are or who you might be.
Or land, yeah.
So, Andrew, is there, in our region, Alley region, obviously, there is this emergence of the tribal entities, and in some ways they seem like it seems like even at AFN, you know, it's another group. And yet, you know, a lot of the same people are managing those. In your region, do you have, what is the role of tribes, and how are you as a corporation, as Chalista Corporation, working either within that group? Is there identification of that?
Yeah, I'm trying to work a lot more closely with the tribes. And at the same time, you know, they have a lot of complaints about ANCSA. And at the same time, I'm trying to kind of educate them on the same problems that arise with the IRA Act, how it formed our village tribes, the kind of issues that arose because of how IRA Act kind of forced them to organize in a system that's not our way. You know, I always used to think just because it was during my formative years, and I started hearing a lot of it after ANCSA was passed about not being easy to follow federal dictates and acts that affect you. I always thought it used to be about ANCSA. But those older folks were also talking about the IRA Act. They just wanted us to learn more to start affecting and changing those acts to our betterment in the long view. You know, it doesn't. They fully knew that it wouldn't take a few years to adapt to ANCSA. They also know it wouldn't take a few years to adapt to the IRA Act. That's why they were reminding us just about every day.
So do you think the people of your region may seek to adapt these Western laws to their ways? Like, can you look at creating a traditional council that's more in line with the Yupik views versus these small IRA councils throughout the region?
Yeah, that'd be really good if it would happen. It would be a lot of work to re-educate. So many of them are so used to being a sovereign entity as a village, you know.
Yeah.
Village by village by village by village.
Other questions, folks?
So if you're,
Go ahead.
so if you're thinking about ANCSA, and you're thinking about the leadership role or coming forward, the next generation of leaders, what do you think their hottest topic, or what do you think they maybe have to focus on the most? Because I think, as I hear you talk, subsistence is something that's very, very galvanizing right now, right? It's something that
Yeah.
we have a lot of focus on as Alaska Native people and as users of our land and our resources traditionally, and wanting to share that going forward. So that there's a focus there. What will be the next issue if you could think about that? What might be the next issue that we might have to think about?
Belonging. Yeah. It's all part of the same issue that's been present from the beginning. We got to come to that point where, as a people, we belong fully. You know, no individual left out, and that will take an examination of not only ANCSA but all the other laws that affect us. The Education Act, the ANELP, IRA Act, all those.
Go ahead.
I'll take it. Sort of as a stem of that, so you talked a lot about the sort of the long history, how you think people look long back, long forward. When you see the next generation coming up in the villages, and sort of this notion that belonging is the next way to go, Are they following the same, the traditional path, or is there a, you know, a big problem with outmigration, one of the things that we've talked about?
Yeah.
Just changes in the villages that are different, that, you know, where they're just becoming more Western?
They're not. It's become separated, and we need to reverse that in my particular region. I think I mentioned at the beginning that when I go to a classroom, I ask who's Yupik or Yupik, and all of them would zoom just like that. I'd explain to them, yeah, you are right in one respect by the laws that define who you are. But then I explain to them from our own way how you're not really a Yupik or a Yupik at that point in time. We need to get that back, and I think a lot of the social ills that we are experiencing nowadays are directly connected to that lack of connection or that lack of teaching on how to become a real human being.
So if I'm following what you're saying, so those are sort of the labels for the separate groups, as opposed to the youth, I think is what you said, was just that individual person, as you sort of relate to each other individually.
Yeah. And we even have a term for white people becoming real human white people, or real human white humans. We recognize that any person can become a real human being, you know.
So for me, what is that?
Kasalukfak. It also refers to Russian Orthodox. I think just because they were the first people that, and like I said, came and completed our Uyag.
So you mentioned that from your perspective, the state is not fulfilling its part and the oil companies are not fulfilling their part of ANELP. Do you feel that the other regions are fulfilling their part, or do you feel that they have a responsibility to help Chilistas to ensure that ANCSA is successful?
Yeah, I don't know about the other regions. Haven't really asked. But in my region, I'm really trying to, and the board of directors are really trying to get a working relationship with our village corporations to ensure that they at least can start to grow and add jobs to their roles. We can't do it ourselves at the regional level. We need our village corporations to be healthy and thriving.
So do you think that the other 12 regions have a responsibility to give you a hand in that?
It's already through the sharing agreement.
But beyond that?
Beyond that, not at this point in time, because they have so many issues like we do, you know. For the day, it's enough that they work on their issues. For the day, it's enough that Chilista works on our issues. We have common issues, but many of them don't have the same solutions and stuff.
I'm interested in a personal question, if I may be so bold as to ask it. How did you end up going to college to become a lawyer? Because that seems very Western to me. How did you make that choice?
I was expected to develop myself, like I said, not only subsistence way, but through this new way. And that was what they started telling us not too long after ANCSA. You got to prepare yourself to help us in this new way.
And the they was the elders?
Yeah, yeah. Our livelihood, subsistence skills were taught by everybody, basically. But to become a real human being was only taught by the elders.
Switching gears, you got a lot of coastal communities with CDQ groups. What's your thoughts on, because I know CDQ groups are coming into play, you know, on the pollock and the bycatch with salmon, and it's impacting the subsistence. There's a lot of that going on, you know, as far as fighting and how that's going to play out. What's your thoughts on how that's going?
In my particular region, we have two CDQ groups, the Kuskokwim Coastal and then the Yukon, Lower Yukon groups. I like what they're doing in terms of the projects that they have and the jobs that they're creating. But then at the same time, subsistence still being such a high or a way of life that we're so dependent on, and the effect that interception has on the fish coming back, there's got to be some balance there. Subsistence won't ever go away, at least in the short term. There's no jobs out there, so people still have to rely on subsistence activities to provide for their families. So in that respect, that should take priority over CDQ activity in terms of taking away from that resource.
Andrew, here in Cook Inlet region, where so many people from so many other regions live, what's the responsibility between those regions and Siri region to make sure that we don't lose the social and cultural skills of our people?
Probably by hosting events and stuff that enable people to get together. It already happens, you know, on the individual family level. I've been here going on 17 years, and from the first week I was here, I was already
hosting your family.
Yeah.
Every time they show up into town. Yeah, I mean.
So it happens with all the other people that have moved into town too. We might be cross town from each other, but we go same
Yeah.
same time.
That's how I was raised.
Yeah.
Andrew, I have a question. So Bristol Bay Native Corporation is just right below Chilista, and Bering Straits is just right above, and you're all coastal regional corporations. So what is different about those two from Chilista that maybe puts them in a different place than Chilista might be in economically?
Economically, Bristol Bay has the fishery, and people living there have that resource, commercial resource. Nome area has the mining history for a long, long time. So those are the two economic differences that differentiate those three regions.
And so do they not rely as much on subsistence as Chilista regional natives do?
They probably still heavily rely on subsistence, but they have those other cash resources to draw from. And their populations aren't as much as my Chilista region's population. So we do have jobs, but a lot more people going after the same jobs. And we have a very, very high birth rate in my region, higher than the other regions, I think.
I heard that from Rose. She was talking about opening enrollment and going.
You know, the regions that have.
Another thing I noticed from this book, they had us read the one that Siri Foundation printed. It gives just an overview of the native corporations, but this was back in 2006, so I don't know what it looks like today. But I noticed that Chilista was really the only native corporation who, since when this book was written, your number of shareholders had actually decreased.
Yeah.
And even with the high birth rate, how do you explain that?
The original shareholders gave it to their kids. who are original shareholders already. Yeah. So that was the reason for the dip. But now it's the original shareholders giving out to the grandkids or people born after December 1871. So we're back up to a little over 13 again.
Okay.
And that'll increase faster going forward. Because the original shareholders, I'm one of the younger original shareholders, are getting up there. If we enroll our kids or descendants, we estimate minimum 40,000 to 60,000 at the high end. Some of the other regions that have enrolled their afterborns have increased by a third, at least a third.
What sort of open enrollment are you considering for that next generation? Are you considering an ongoing enrollment or a one-time?
We haven't gotten to that question yet. We just want to gauge shareholder support for including our post-Anson natives.
So as you talk about shareholders, in the Alley region, we have about a third of ours that live in the region, about a third live in Anchorage or South Central Alaska or the rest of Alaska, and about a third live, outside of Alaska or in the Pacific Northwest really is where the majority of ours live. What's your demographic?
We just looked at it about a year and a half ago. I think our number's like 83% still out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that really makes up, when you look at the total population of Alaska Native people in the state of Alaska being around, 120,000. If we extrapolated all the descendants in Chalista, that would make up, close to 50% of the Alaska Native Alaska population. Would you say that would be probably a...
That,
Because, if you think about that, thinking like in numbers, maybe 40% of Alaska Natives in Alaska would be Chalista.
I think we have shareholders in every state too, even foreign nations now.
If you opened up the rolls though in all of the regions, wouldn't it be true that there'd be lots of people who become shareholders of multiple regions? So that group of 40 or 60,000 wouldn't be distinctly independent of the descendant group of Syria and of the descendant group of others.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be a cut of the population quite that way, I don't think.
Yeah, there's a lot of intermarriage now. Yeah.
I believe some of the regions have developed restrictions for opening enrollment, that you can't be enrolled in another Native corporation in order to get some of that stock.
But
Every
it's also a problem in trying to implement that, because realistically, you don't
Right,
know, and you're
yeah.
relying on what somebody says, and there's many
Right,
instances
you have to-
where people are incorrectly reporting.
That's generous.
I used to work in the legal department.
Well, I know now it's kind of a discussion based on what Shauna was talking about, whether you gift shares, to your children or your grandchildren. Because if you do give shares to your children or your grandchildren, and then there's open enrollment, would they be qualified for the open enrollment because they've already been gifted shares? I know that's among our kind of a generation, well, do you gift or don't you gift? So we're kind of tackling that issue, because if there is open enrollment, would it be better to see where open enrollment goes? And I think there's a tendency now to really look at that issue, and more regional corporations are going to open enrollment. So if you gift,
When the regions that have chosen to go to an open enrollment, is it an exact equal share? Is it the exact same number of shares? Is it 100? I don't have any
One
idea
firm
about
that does an interesting thing is Aetna, and I think it's that they issue 70 initially. It's like the state stock, it's 70 initially, and then when the youth graduate, they get the other 30 shares. If they
From high
don't
school?
graduate, then
Yeah.
they have to wait until they're 21.
Huh.
There's
So
a
that's
lot
kind of
of-
an interesting incentive to me.
There's some tribes in lower 48 doing that too, and they're literally keeping per caps, which are dividend payments in Alaska, but keeping their per cap payments from gaining until the individual graduates from high school, and then if they graduate from college, they make even more in per cap payments and dividend payments to encourage their youth to go to college and get an education.
Huh.
Which I think is an interesting solution to failure to graduate. And I think what that spurred in my memory is there's indigenous cultures in other countries who use the cultural link to define whether or not you're a member of their tribe, or if we were to apply it to corporations, could be potentially a member of a corporation. So for instance, the Sami, you're only Sami if you're a fluent Sami speaker. Wouldn't it be interesting if corporations took that open enrollment and said, you're only a Cognac shareholder or an Aliu Corporation shareholder if you are fluent in your language? Talk about a spur to start language revitalization and create, instead of talking about the death of our language, we're talking about them as living. In our village, there was no way that open enrollment was going to pass because our dividend payments are so substantial to our shareholders. And so what our board decided to do instead was a Just One campaign, where essentially we did an entire public relations campaign with our shareholder base and told them that they need to, our shareholders should really consider gifting at least just one share to give our descendants a voice and the ability to vote in our corporation elections, to serve as board members, and to really be involved in our ANELP Village Corporation. And the results of that push was phenomenal. We had 550 original shareholders. When we started the campaign, we had about 750 shareholders. We are now at over 950, and it's been less than a year. So we've seen, we have been,
But the
sweating
other
in
component
shareholder
to that
services.
is that the board elected to no longer provide any benefits to descendants, which forced shareholders to give shares to their descendants, because if you want your kid to go to college, they're not getting a scholarship from our village corporation unless they're a shareholder. Right, so you better believe people were gifting shares left, right, and center.
There's a challenge to that too, and just speaking from the shareholder records perspective, in trying to, particularly when we're talking about, our demographic, we've got about a third of our shareholders living out of state too, so trying to engage people with one share, or even, 5 shares to vote and to cash their checks.
Right.
And to participate. That just, that's a kind of a hard thing. And so, gifting shares is good, but I think there's a responsibility that needs to go along with that. That if you're going to gift your shares, hopefully you try and make the person you're giving those shares to care enough to participate.
Right, and it's an entire shift to demographics now, because as a shareholder services department, original shareholders are now the minority in our corporation. And so when we have now the majority of our shareholders who weren't alive when ANELP was passed, don't have that personal history of the act, how are they engaged with our company? How do they see value? What's the value add to them? Is it just the dividend payments, or is it the land? Is it something more than that? And so now we're tasked with this amazing responsibility of educating an entire generation of shareholders who have been disenfranchised from our company since birth. But anyway, I could go off. Stop listening.
So does anybody have any additional questions for Andrew?
I have one. You mentioned that ANELP is on the verge of failure for your region for the economic reasons. What would be a success? What do you see that has been a success through ANELP, either for your region or for your?
Success will come when each corporation, whether it be region or village, is growing and adding jobs. That's the intent of ANELP, to transition a group of people from one livelihood into another livelihood system. And that's the only way that success can be measured based on that intent. Is for each corporation to be growing and adding jobs.
Anything else?
You know, I guess just a follow-up question on that. So in your position then, as you lead Chalista, how do you focus a lot of effort then corporately in business development back at within the region and specifically on job creation, that type of thing, or are you focused also? I know that you're starting to pay dividends and things. Is that started? I mean, how do you prioritize that, and what are you doing back in region?
We have to do both in my mind, and that's what we're trying to do. Grow, the money benefits, dividends, scholarships, donations, burial assistance, those kind of stuff. And we also have to start and grow businesses that provide jobs out there. There's nothing better than being able to provide for your own, and that's our system, to be independent and productive. And that was the promise of ANCSA, and that's why we accepted it, because it would enable us to provide for ourselves. That's one of the definitions of becoming a real human being. To be a productive citizen that provides for you, not only for you, but for your family and for extended family and for the community. So we're working on that. But like I said, we need the factors in place in order for those corporations to be operating successfully, and not just successfully, to be growing. You can only add jobs if you're growing. Everybody has to do their part. We're doing our part. The other players have to start doing their part too.
All right. Andrew, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to